I want to start by saying thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I know you've had lots going on, lots of things in your world. And so you making time for this conversation today is just fills my heart with so much joy. So I am so grateful.
Well, thank you. Well, you're welcome. And thank you so much for inviting me. It means a lot to me that you would invite me to be here. So there's so many things that I love and so many things that you've written that I love that we're going to talk about as we go. But I'd love for you to start by tell us who you are, what it is that you do. Okay. Well, I am Candyce Ossefort-Russell, and I am a licensed professional counselor supervisor in Austin, Texas. I have a private practice where I see adult clients I do a lot of work with grief, life transition, and I also do a lot of work with adults who are very high functioning, but have a whole lot of childhood trauma. And so and I do a lot of postgraduate training for therapists. And I'm a writer. And so I think my story about how and why I became a therapist is crucial to what I do. And so is that okay if I just tell you that story?
I would love for you. I was going to dig into that and say that you did, when you were a little girl, let me ask you this question. When you were little, what did you want to be?
When I was little, I didn't really know myself. And so when I was a little kid, I wanted to be a nurse because my mother was a nurse. And then I was a smart kid, and my outstandingness was being a good student. So I did really well in school, but I didn't know what I wanted to focus on. And so my father actually told me being in computer science would be a good idea because it was an up and coming field. So I got my undergraduate degree in computer science. And anyway, that didn't stick, which clearly I'm a therapist, not a computer science person. But so anyway, I mean, that's part of my story too, is that I was a good kid and very compliant with what I was supposed to do in school and what my parents wanted me to do, but I didn't really know myself very well. But I look back on I don't have a lot of journals or anything from childhood, but I look back on little snippets of pieces of writing that I found. And I've always had an interest in transformation. I remember being really interested in butterflies, how they would go into the cocoon and come out as butterflies. I was always interested in death and rebirth and stuff like that. So I think the seeds for where I am now were in my childhood, but I wasn't really aware of it then. Does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense. And so how did you tell me so what did you actually do? So before you were a therapist, because this wasn't your first career, so to speak.
Right.
What did you actually do? So you graduate with computer science degree. And then what did you use that for?
So I graduated with honors in computer science. And then I moved to Austin, Texas to work for IBM as an assembly language programmer. And yes, I did. And I was winning awards and everything. I did that for 4 years. And I really never loved it. I was good at it. But the good thing about going to IBM is I met my husband there. And so,
thank you, IBM.
Yes, thank you, IBM.
And so you did that, and then you obviously met your husband, and you had your child. You had a son.
That's right. Yes. So I actually was complaining about my job about 4 years into working for IBM, a couple of years after I married my husband, Marty. Marty is my husband. And I was complaining about my job, and he said, "Are you going to complain about your job for the rest of your life, or are you going to do something about it?" And he was a very kind man who meant that from the deepest sense of kindness. But he didn't know what he started rolling with that question, because I realized as soon as he asked me that, I was like, oh my gosh, you're right. What am I going to do? So that's the first time I went to therapy, is figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. And
so let's just pause on that for a moment, Candice, because for most people, so I know so many people in my coaching business and the people I coach, people will ask that question. And nowadays, there are people like me who are life coaches, but I'm going to guess this was several years ago. It wasn't like, in my mind, I wouldn't naturally have thought, I don't know what to do with my life. Let me go to a therapist. What was it that made you decide, I need to go to a therapist?
Yeah, I had a really good friend who was in therapy just to explore life. And she talked to me about it. She always told me what was going on in her life and in her therapy and stuff. So when I started to realize that I wanted to change careers, but I had no idea what I wanted to do, I asked her, I remember standing in her kitchen saying, would you recommend your therapist to somebody who feels like her life is coming apart and she doesn't know what to do? And she said, yes. So I went to that therapist, and she just really started helping me figure out basically how to get in touch with my true self so that I could discern what I wanted to do rather than just like leap to some other job. She helped me figure out who I was and what I wanted. And one of the things, this leads to my story about my son. So she actually instigated something. One thing we learned is that I had a fear of the unknown, which most of us have, but like, just since I was so compliant and did what everybody said I should do, I had very low tolerance for like sitting in a space of unknown and seeing what emerged. So she suggested that maybe I should quit my job at IBM before I knew what I was going to do next. And Marty, my husband, was like, why not? Because we had enough income that we could live on. But I was like, but that's not fair. I can't just quit my job and not know what I'm doing. He said, but you hate your job and I don't. That's the kind of person he was. So I quit my job, and then I got pregnant with my son, and then I had my son and decided to stay home with him for a while, for some years when he was little, since I was in career transition anyway. And then that leads to the next part of the story, which is Marty and I were really best friends. We had a really lovely marriage, and we were having so much fun having our first child. But the day after Christmas, our child's first Christmas, when our son was 9 months old, my husband developed shortness of breath, and I had to take him to the emergency room. And he ended up he was a healthy 39-year-old runner, and he got a virus that attacked his heart. And he went into the emergency room. They discovered it was his heart, and he was having heart failure. And long story short, he was in intensive care for 6 weeks, had to have a heart transplant, and did not survive the surgery for the heart transplant that he got on Valentine's Day. Got a heart on Valentine's Day. You can't make this up.
So literally he was 39 years old.
Yes.
Fit, healthy man who'd just had his son. Life was good. He loved his job. And then he was gone.
That's right. In 6 weeks, he was gone.
Wow.
And I was 30 and I was a widow. And so even now that was 30 years ago. And my son was 11 months old to the day when my husband died. And so fortunately, I had this history with that therapist. And fortunately, I had the means to go see her again. I always say I went and fell into her lap. And
was that the first thing that you thought? So like, if you can, what were some of the feelings? 'Cause I know that so many people, feel grief differently. But for you,
yes.
What did you feel? Because I can only imagine what that's like. Your son's not even a year old. You're
Yes.
30 years old. Your husband, who you love dearly, just boom, sick in
Yes.
this place for 6 weeks. Your life has
Yes.
transformed
Yes.
beyond anything you could have imagined.
Yes.
What's the feeling that you felt most in that
Yes.
time?
Yeah. I was devastated. I mean, I felt annihilated. And one of the things, though, that I also felt was a deep sense of knowing that I had to go down and through this grief process, because it was profoundly painful, because I felt that I describe it as being torn in two, because the part of me that felt annihilated and devastated wanted to just crawl in bed and pull the covers over my head. And I didn't care whether I woke up in the morning or not. But the part of me that was a mom was a mom. And that mom energy is like, I wanted, it wasn't just intellectual. My viscera wanted to be a good mom, and also responded to my son's cuteness and aliveness and stuff. So that's what I call torn in two, because that part of me wanted to just do everything I could to be a good mom. And the other part of me just didn't care whether I lived or died. And so I had this sense in that spot of feeling both of those, that in order to give my son the most normal childhood he could have with a mother who wasn't depressed, was to go down and through the grief process. I had an instinctual feeling that the grief process itself was full of aliveness, even though it was excruciating, whereas to avoid it would have been to get depressed, which is not the same thing. And so, yeah.
Do you feel like, in hindsight, because we never know, right, in the moment, but in hindsight, do you feel like your son became the purpose? Like, if you hadn't had your son, do you think it would have been different?
I do think that. I think that I often will say that I went on and lived my life for my son. But I knew even then, I thought, if I live for him long enough, someday I'll care about my own life again. And that proved to be true. But yes, he was the purpose that kept me going. And paradoxically, the purpose that made me fierce about feeling all of my feelings and not giving in to the cultural norms of wanting me to get over it quickly, wanting me to feel better after a year. I'm sorry, you don't feel better after a year when something like this happens, And so that is why I ended up going back to my therapist, is because fortunately my family was not part of the culture trying to make me get over it quickly. My parents and Marty's parents were really supportive. I couldn't have done it without them. And they didn't try to rush me through the process, but the rest of the culture did. People can't stand it when you're in pain for a long time. And so I needed to have a place to go to sit with someone who was not afraid of being with me. And my therapist, the one who helped me with my career transition, turned out to be someone who was really good with grief. And she sat with me for years in the darkest, most despairing places, and through all the loneliness and pain that I went through, and on through till I sat with her for 12 years, really. The 5 years was the worst of it, but I sat with her till I remarried when my son was 12. So
do you still, because I see you getting a little teary there, do you still feel like you have some grief, or that you still feel some grief or some sadness?
Yes, it's not present all the time. I mean, that's what I tell people that I work with grief, is that it's no longer all of who I am. And when I feel it, it's not as intense as it was then, but definitely when I turn straight towards it and look right at it, there's still definitely feelings there. And on different occasions, it'll come around. Like, my son just graduated from graduate school, and anytime there's a momentous occasion for him, I'll have a little pang of grief, wishing his dad could see him, that kind of thing. So.
It's so
Yeah.
interesting that we're having this conversation today, and I'm feeling myself get emotional because
Yeah.
my mother-in-law passed away 20 years ago today.
Oh,
And to
wow.
what you said, like society says, it's been 20 years. You've had 20 years to get over it.
Right.
And yet, like you said, there are moments like it's not like there was a time for us as a family where literally
Yes.
we were in the grief. And 20
Yes.
years on, I literally was having that kind of feeling like, well, it's been 20 years. Shouldn't we be okay about it now? Like,
Hmm.
it's been 20 years. We should be over it.
Yes.
But it is in these moments like today where it was like, oh, this is 20 years and
Yes.
all of that. And so I love what you just said about, society wants us to be, well, you've had your 1 year or you've had your 5 years, like move on,
Hmm.
get
Yes.
over it. So is it
Right.
normal for people to continue to feel some level of grief, some level of sadness?
Yes, it is. That is actually how it works. What I say is we don't ever get over it, but it finds a place to live in our heart. So it's not that it goes away or that you move on, but you do move forward. Life keeps going and it does change. But I do find that it finds a place to live in my heart where a lot of times it's there and I'm not noticing it, these days, but it is there. And when something touches that part of my heart, it lights up. And that is normal. In fact, what they talk about in grief stuff is continuing bonds that the olden days of Freud and stuff, they used to talk about how getting through a grief process meant you gradually like cut off ties with the dead person. But instead, what really does help is what they call continuing bonds, which is finding ways to stay connected to the person who's died inside yourself. And
That's
that
so
it's a lot.
beautiful.
Yeah.
I love
Isn't
that
it?
because that what and my father passed away 3 years
Mhm.
ago in June,
Uh-huh.
and
Uh-huh.
there are times for me where I feel like I'm forgetting, I'm
Yes.
forgetting the sound of his voice, or I'm forgetting
Yes.
like what exactly
Yes.
what he looked like. And so
Yes.
is that actually a good thing then for me to continue to remind myself? Because that's what society says is, what, just forget about them. Life moves on and
Yeah.
move on.
I actually think it's much easier, if that's the right word. We're much more able to keep moving on with our lives if we develop continuing bonds. Because I think sometimes people who get stuck in grief, because people can get stuck. I have a lot to say about that too, but right now I'll just say if you get stuck, it can often be because you're afraid that you're going to forget if you move on. And so giving people permission to find ways to feel connected inside themselves can allow them to keep moving forward, knowing you're carrying your loved one in your heart rather than leaving them behind and forgetting they existed.
Mm-hmm. So tell me about that. Let's talk about it since you've mentioned it.
Mm-hmm.
What does that look like? How is it different? I don't want to forget my loved one, but at the same time, I don't want to be stuck in the grief forever.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
What's
Well,
the
one
difference?
thing, the difference is because I actually felt an intensity of grief that really was heavy for at least 5 years. And that's normal too, when you've had a traumatic loss like that. So what I went through was different than being stuck in the grief. Being stuck is more like you ruminate on it and you can't get on with life. It's like you really have a hard time functioning. You have a hard time thinking about anything else. You rarely have times of feeling good or happy, and because when grief is moving through, even if you're at a low point for a long time, it's punctuated by moments of laughter and happiness and ability to do other things. And but depression or getting stuck in grief feels more like there's no movement. It's like the grief doesn't move, even though even though like my grief was big, it would move. And sometimes I felt angry, and sometimes I felt devastatingly sad. And sometimes I felt kind of shut down and I didn't want to do anything. And other times I was chasing my son around and giggling with him, so so there's the difference between something that doesn't move and something that does move.
So let's talk about how did you go from this devastating experience, this devastating moment in your life where you were working at IBM, then you quit your job, then you're home with your son. How did you then go to what you do now?
So that actually directly came from my loss, in that I did start when I was in that career transition time before he died. I was getting inklings that I was interested in psychology, but I was young. I was I wasn't 30 yet when I was thinking about this. And I had like this glimpse of being a therapist, but I knew I didn't have enough life experience to really help people with anything. and I did fortunately have the means to keep staying home with my son for about 5 years after my husband died, because his father had died when he was 18. So as soon as I got pregnant, he said, if we want you to stay home with this baby, I better get life insurance in case anything ever happens to me. I was 30. I'm like, sure, sounds like a good idea, whatever, And so I wasn't rich by any means, but I had just enough money to stay home for about 5 years. So in therapy, going through that kind of a loss with somebody who was able to sit with me shattered all my ways of being we all have different false selves that we end up learning how to use in order to function in our families and in the world. And all the ways that I was such a good girl and compliant and did things because I was supposed to instead of because I knew I wanted or needed to, all that shattered along with everything else. And so going through this grief process with my therapist really helped me discover myself at the deepest root of who I was. It was an excruciating process, but it was powerful. And around 4.5 years into this, I knew I needed to start figuring out what I was going to do, because I couldn't keep staying home forever. And I remember being out on a run one day, and I just knew I need to be a therapist. But I knew that training was intensive. And so I got home from the run and I talked myself out of it. I was like, I can't afford to do that. I can't go to school and get supervised out. I'm a single mom. I can't do it. And then I get really kind of down again. And then I'd go out on a run the next day. And during the run, this would come to me again, and I'd be all exhilarated. And finally, I was like, I have been looking for what I'm passionate about doing. And now the universe is saying, here it is. And I'm saying, no, thank you. And I decided I better say yes. And I said yes. And I went to grad school and I became a therapist. And that matters to me more than anything, because what I knew then was I did have life experience, and I had the utter faith that knowing somebody just sitting there with me in those dark times without trying to change me or talk me out of it, but not leaving me alone, that is what helped me transform myself. And I wanted to give that to other people. And then that led me to want to eventually start training other therapists, because in my naivete, the therapist I had, I thought that's what all therapists were like, because I'd only had one. And guess what? It's not. There are so many therapist training programs and therapy models that are about trying to fix broken people. And I don't believe in that. I don't believe in that at all. What I think is that therapy is about helping people get to know who they really are, and that we all have suffering. We all have wounds, and to learn how to work with those wounds and heal and become all of who we can be is what I think therapy is for. And so I'm also passionate about training therapists to be able to have the courage to sit with people and not try to fix them. So
I love this line on your website. You
Uh-huh.
said, going through darkness and coming out changed taught me wisdom, acceptance, and compassion. And I think that, what I know of you, having, been in a group with you before, that's the one thing that I think has always been, that I've always so admired about you, is the passion that you have for your work. And I know we focused a lot on the part where you deal with grief, but there's so much more to you and to the work that you do and how you help people. And I was, looking around on your website and looking at some of the different things that you help people with, because I think for most people, yes, they get it that, okay, yes, helping people deal with painful circumstances, like, a loss of a loved one, but it's so much more. It's things like desire to change is something else that you have listed. So
Yes.
tell me about some of the other ways that you help people go through their lives or become better in their lives and create their extraordinary life.
Yes. Yes. I think it's mostly about helping people discover what they really want from life, and also how to deal with all the emotions of life. Because again, our culture is really not good at helping people be in painful emotions. And so what I find is that anytime there's a life transition, positive or negative, right, where it can be retirement, you're excited about retiring, or it can be getting pregnant and having it come out successfully. It can be getting married, or it can be getting divorced, or having a miscarriage, or up or down. When there is a big life transition, what I found is so interesting about my work with loss is that when there is a life transition, there is always loss. There is the loss of the former self, the self that you have been up until now. And then there's a period of in between where you're becoming the person you're going to be. And that's a real indeterminate period of time. And we don't do uncertainty very well in this society. So any kind of life transition can be a prime opportunity for exploring yourself, because there is like a sense of coming apart, of being undone, about not knowing who you are anymore, and then staying in the uncertainty and learning to listen to your soul, to your inner voice, and then discover who you want to be and what you want. And that can be spiritual, that can be career, that can be relationship. It's anything in life that's important to you. And then also, this ties back to how people can get stuck in grief. We learn how to be with big emotions from our parents. They've shown that the way we learn how to regulate emotions happens when we're in the first 3 years of life, for the most part. And so unfortunately, well, fortunately and unfortunately, our parents grew up in a society that didn't deal well with feelings either. So most parents aren't that great at helping kids learn how to fully feel all their feelings and really reflect who they are. So what I find, whether it's life transition or a big grief process, once big feelings start to emerge, oftentimes they get stuck. We don't know what to do with them because nobody ever taught us. So that's the thing that I really get annoyed by in the grief literature, now making prolonged grief a disorder, is that first of all, grief takes as long as it takes. Second, if grief is getting stuck, or somebody can't feel their grief when they need to feel their grief, it's not because something's wrong with their grief. It's because the grief is an enormous set of emotions pushing up through the ways you're used to coping with emotions, and those ways of coping don't work anymore. And so if there's a stuckness in grief, it's because the grief is actually giving you a painful opportunity to heal old stuff around big emotions. So that's part of grief work, but it's also part of any work I do with people, is learning how to recognize the things that might be happening in the moment today that are actually relics from your past of not knowing how to be with yourself around big emotions. So
you said something that I think many people wouldn't even think that, oh, this is an opportunity for me to go and seek help or get therapy. Although it is starting to be spoken about more, is when, as you said, big life transitions, and especially for us women having a baby. Because for most people, it's like, oh my gosh, it's so happy. It's so, all of the things, right? We just focus on the good side of it all. But as you rightly said, it's a huge transition, and there is a level of loss, a level of grief that needs to happen for who you were before, right? So how do you see a lot of women who come in, or is that something that's not yet really spoken about widely in the industry?
Well, it's spoken about a lot in therapeutic world. I think it's not spoken about among women as much. I mean, I think maybe it's getting better, but what I find is young moms or pregnant women tend to feel really isolated and afraid because they think there's something wrong with them, because they're grieving or they're having a hard time, and the other thing is, we don't know as a society that you can feel more than one thing at a time. And that's so wrong. We feel more than one thing at a time all the time. So new moms who are sad about losing their old life or who get angry. I'm not talking about abuse. I'm talking about an emotion. Like when you feel angry at your infant because it won't take a nap or whatever, these big emotions that might not be pretty that you feel towards your baby. Women feel ashamed and scared. They feel like that means they don't love their child or that they wish they didn't have their child. And the truth is, all of it's true at once. You can be so in love with your infant, so happy to have this baby, and simultaneously feel sad about stuff from your old life that you lost, your identity as a self before motherhood, or upset about how sleep deprived you are and how you didn't realize how bad that was going to be, and kind of pissed off that nobody told you, So yes, it's all of that. And I actually find that that's one of the things people find surprising about coming to therapy. I think a lot of people think that it's for people who are broken or sick, and that I'm going to tell you what's wrong with you and then we'll fix it. But no, it's about having your experience normalized, and you feel not alone for the first time, perhaps not alone with this experience. And you realize you're just a human having a life experience and that you're not alone with it. That's so relieving.
That's what I love about the work that you do and the articles that you write, Candice, is that you're making people feel not so alone. Because just in this conversation about, the duality of the emotions that you can feel as a mom, as a, someone retiring, all of these things, because we're taught, like, I know certainly when I had my child, it was, you should be happy. You should be happy you have a child, should be happy. Like, it's just meant to be. And so when you have these emotions that are like, this must make me a monster, this must make me a terrible person.
Right.
And thinking about big emotions as well, I think something that we as a collective, as the world, have been experiencing over the last couple of years, last 3 years, has been the pandemic, and how out of that we've experienced profound loss.
Absolutely.
How can people deal with that? I know you contributed to a beautiful article that we'll link to for the skip, but can you help us understand, like, is it okay that I feel, because there was also with that, talking about duality of emotions.
Yes.
A lot of what I saw on social media was people feeling guilty that they didn't have it as bad as other people. I didn't lose my job. I didn't. And so it's like, oh, okay, so I can't really say I suffered. So can you talk about that, and how do we deal with something as big as a global pandemic?
Yes, I think that is so important, because the pandemic really put that into sharp relief, but I think it happens daily, that my experience is that if you avoid your own pain, then you don't know how to feel pain really. And so you can't feel with another person. And so if you say, my pain isn't as bad as somebody else's, therefore I have no right to feel it, and then you park it, now you're numb. And now you're not feeling anything. And your compassion for others is going to be intellectual. It's not going to be a felt sense. Because my experience is that when you turn towards your own pain, not comparatively, you don't have to say, I have it as bad as so-and-so, but that's where you can feel more than one thing at a time. You can say, you can feel deeply grateful that you still have your job and that you didn't lose income. Feel very grateful. And at the same time, feel devastated that you missed the birth of your grandchild or whatever, and so also when you allow yourself to feel your own mourning and pain around what has happened to you, there is powerful emotion, powerful information within that emotion. And the adaptive actions that come from feeling your sadness include softness and compassion. When you dive down into your own pain, you find the place where we are all connected. And then you're not afraid of pain. And so then you can sit across from somebody else who is suffering the same thing you are or from something worse and be able to say, my goodness, I'm so sorry. Can you see I'm here with you? Instead of offering platitudes or glib statements of it'll get better or there's a plan or some crap like that. So going down into your own pain, it heals something and it also generates compassion, like real felt sense compassion that makes it almost impossible for you not to take action to try to be with others who are suffering in some way that helps.
So how do we, so that you brought up a great question about platitudes, when people have a loss, I think that the reason so many people just feel like saying to people get over it is because it's uncomfortable for them, because I don't know how to be with you in your pain, or I don't know the right thing to say, or what do I say? And so how should we help people? So if we experience someone who's had a loss, what do we say? How do we, what do we say?
Yes. Well, first of all, I have a great article that I wrote about that too. It's called Want to Help Your Grieving Friend, 5 Ways to Really Help, something like that. And
we'll link to it.
Okay. I love that article. And one of the things so 2 things about that. One is have compassion first notice that you're uncomfortable and you don't know what to say. And then have compassion for yourself, because I try to help people understand that as caring people, we have, just like in what attachment theory shows is that when we're babies, we have an attachment impulse, right? We must be close to our parent in order to survive. Likewise, on the flip side, we all have a caregiving basic wired in biological caregiving system. And the caregiving system responds to the suffering of someone we care about with an impulse to protect. Like if you think about having your baby, that's the first, you want to protect them from sadness. You want to protect them from harm. And that is an appropriate response up to a point. But as children grow, we also need to not only protect them, but allow them to have experiences and let them know we have faith in them. Let them know we have trust and faith that they can go out into the world and have an experience, and then they can come share their excitement or their pain with us. And so that is the being with impulse. But the reason I'm bringing this up around grief is that the caregiving impulse comes first. So when you see a friend who's suffering in grief, your impulse is going to be to protect them from that pain. That is where a lot of this discomfort comes from. And so that's where the reflex to say, it's all going to get better soon. You're going to, there's a plan, whatever it is, right? That's the impulse to make that pain stop. But the reason I explain where that pain comes from is because when you understand what it is, it's easier to soothe it. So if you notice yourself having discomfort when you're with somebody who's suffering somehow, notice that and soothe yourself. Say, that's that spot where I want to protect them from their pain. Now's not time for that. You can sit over here and I'm going to just be with them in their pain. Because leaving somebody not alone is the only thing that helps. So what you say is, I'm so sorry. And then if you don't know what else to say, it's much better to say, this is such a big loss. I don't even know what to say. It's better to say, I don't even know what to say, instead of trying to figure out what to say. And then you can say, do you want to talk about it, or do you want to just be here with me? I'm here if you want to talk, and let them decide. Because sometimes people really do want to talk, but sometimes you're in public and you don't want to start talking about it and start crying out here in the grocery store or whatever. But asking. And then a lot of the grief stuff now says offer to do something concrete, which is rather than say, I'm here if you need me. But I would put a caveat in that. You could say, I'm available to help take care of your kid if you need a break. Would you like me to call and check in with you about that? Don't just call and say, I'm available to come over and take care of your kid, because sometimes, like, I needed my kid to only stay with his grandparents for a little while. I couldn't stand to let him out of my sight. I could bring you a meal. Would it work for you for me to drop something off next Wednesday? Yeah. So those are some things.
That is so beautiful. I'm going to take that on, because that's something that I've sometimes had difficulty with, in terms of someone has a loss and then I'm like, I don't know what to say to you. So now I'm just going to avoid you because I don't want to say the wrong thing.
Right.
So it really is just it's okay to just sit in silence with them.
Yes, it is.
That's what they want. That's
right. It is. Because remember, being met, being understood, being cared about, that's the only thing that can help a situation that can't be fixed.
Mm-hmm. Speaking about articles, another beautiful article that you wrote, something that I actually shared on my social media on Mother's Day. You wrote this beautiful article about how to cope if Mother's Day is hard for you. Tell me about some of the things that you wrote in that article and what prompted you to write that article.
Well, are you talking about the one in the Skim where I was interviewed, or the one that I wrote?
Actually, you know what? In the Skim, in that article, they linked to a beautiful article that you had written about your first Mother's Day without your husband, and I literally made me tear up because I could imagine it. And we'll link to it. But where you describe the scene where your son is in the yard writing with chalk on the pavement, and you're writing Happy Mother's Day to yourself. I could feel that. So beautiful. So tell me about the writing of that article, and then also what the other article that you've written in the Skim to help people for whom Mother's Day is difficult.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was that Mother's Day is one of those times that, like, I noticed for me when I was widowed and I was a young mom, people didn't know what to say to me. They didn't know what to do. So people either said really stupid stuff that was actually kind of hurtful, or they didn't mention it or contact me in any way. And it was a really hard day. And so I was prompted to write these articles in order to help people know how to be with people who might be having a hard time on Mother's Day. And then that led me to think, and especially having been a therapist all this time and also having compassion for people who are having a hard time, led me to think about other kinds of ways Mother's Day might be hard, like for a woman who's had a lot of miscarriages and is still trying to have a child and can't, or a woman who doesn't want children and is made to feel less than because she's not a mother, or a woman or a man who has a mother who is abusive, or somebody whose mother died recently, or, there's a lot of different situations where celebrating mothers might be painful for somebody. And so my overall sense of how to help people with any of these situations is to gently say something about it. I think we're so worried that people say, I don't want to upset her. It's like, guess what? She's already upset. And so you're not going to upset someone. If you say something and they start to feel an emotion, that emotion was already there. You can't force somebody to feel something. And if they don't want to feel it right now, allow them to walk away, move away from it. But gently mention something like, I'm wondering if Mother's Day is hard for you this year. And then say something like, I'm here if you want to talk, but if you don't want to, just know I'm thinking about you. So that you're also not assuming that people do want to talk about it. Maybe they're a really private person. Maybe it's not hard. Maybe they've moved on, or maybe their mother died and they had a terrible relationship with their mother and they're actually kind of glad that she's gone. That happens, and so we can't assume anyone's having an experience that's just like our own or like we would imagine it, but saying, I'm wondering if it's hard and I'm here if you want to talk.
Yeah. Candice, how do we, this is probably such a broad question, a big question, but one of the things that you've talked about in our conversation today is how we have such a hard time feeling our feelings, and that so many of us have never been taught how to feel our feelings. So if someone doesn't have the means to go to a therapist, or maybe is resistant to going to a therapist, where would they start, or how do they start to even begin to feel the feelings?
Well, I wrote a series of articles during the pandemic for this very thing. It's that's called
you'll send it to me and
I'll send it to you. But anyway, it's a 6-part series about how to start to work with your big emotion, how to feel your emotions. But one thing that you might want to start with is reading books that are about feeling emotions. And I can tell you that Daniel Siegel writes a lot of books about how emotions work and how to get in touch with your emotions and that kind of thing. So reading to me helps, because if you find an author you like, and I'm not talking about just self-help that some self-help is fine, but some are books out there are just like the things we're talking about. They try to talk you into feeling positive all the time. But but I find,
all good vibes.
That's only. Right. Yes. But finding books that actually help, that resonate with you about how to, whether it's about grief or whether it's about divorce or whether it's about just how to feel your feelings. There's another really good book out there called It's Not Always Depression by Hillary Jacobs Hendel, I think. And there's some good stuff out there now about what emotions are and what they're like and how to begin to turn towards them. I find reading can be really helpful, because if you find an author you resonate with, that begins that feeling of not feeling alone. You can feel met by an author. But if you don't like reading and you can't find the right book, try journaling. Journaling can really get you in touch with your emotions. Journaling saved my life after my husband died. And when I talk about journaling, I don't necessarily mean journaling to a writing prompt, unless that helps you, but just stream of consciousness for 3 pages and see what comes, and let whatever you have to say just spill out on the page. Because if you do that on a regular basis, you will start you will start to know what's going on inside your own head and heart. And that's a great way for people who don't have any other means or, pathway towards working with emotions to work with. If you hate journaling, because there are definitely a lot of people who hate journaling, what I would suggest instead is think about something that if you were going to journal, you'd journal about, like something you're having feelings about or a situation you're in, and drop it into your mind with curiosity. Like, how do I feel about this? What do I want to do about this? And then go for a walk. And I don't mean think about it. I mean, put it in your mind and then let it run in the background of your unconscious while you go for a long walk. Because that can be like a physical way of journaling. It's just inviting your psyche to kind of process stuff. And then maybe after your walk, pause for a minute and just see if any ideas or thoughts come.
And so last question for you here. This has been such a beautiful conversation, and I literally feel like we could talk forever. But I'd love to ask for anybody who does have the means, or anybody who's looking to explore going to therapy, finding a therapist. What are some tips that you have for finding a good therapist? What are the things that you can go ask a therapist? How do you have a relationship with your therapist?
That's a really good question. First of all, just know that finding a therapist is about finding somebody who feels like a good fit to you. So you should feel cared about and received with warmth, and like the person you're sitting across from cares about you. Some people like that neutral psychoanalytic kind of response, but most people don't really respond well to that. And there's a lot of therapists out there now who work from a warm and engaged perspective. So you should feel respected and cared about and understood. So that's the first thing. If you feel judged or you feel like somebody is putting you in a box that doesn't feel right to you, you don't have to stay. You might have to try several therapists till you find somebody where you're just like, yes, this feels right. I would ask a therapist, I would ask, have you ever been in therapy? A lot of therapists might bristle at that question, but if they do, run. I would not go to a therapist who's never been in therapy, because being in therapy yourself helps you explore your own inner world, and it helps you understand that you can bear to be with people through all kinds of hard stuff. So I would ask a therapist, have you been in therapy? And you don't need to get personal about what did you learn there, but have you been in therapy and did it teach you some things? And then ask them a little bit about how they work and see how that fits for you.
I would never have thought to ask a therapist, have you ever been in therapy? But it makes total sense. How can you be effective if you've never experienced what you're doing?
That's right.
That's a really great question. I'd love to ask you this question because it's something that popped in my head. What do you think your husband, Marty, would think of who you are now in the life that you're living?
I love that. I think Marty would be very proud of me and of my son. And I think he would really love how I parented our child. And I always felt like Marty was 9 years older than I was, and his father had died when he was 18. And so he had a wisdom about him and a depth. And I always felt like I was also a pretty deep person. And I felt like we were at the same level of depth, but he was farther along than I was on the path. And I felt like the day I lost him, I caught up. And I feel like I used to always say, I was able to completely fall apart, let grief shatter me, and then rebuild myself one shard at a time because I had him. Because I knew he loved me, and because I had seen what a wise person who'd gone through grief looked like. And so I feel like he would resonate with the way I lived through that grief process and came out to make use of all of that in a way that helps others. So
I imagine he would be so proud. So proud
yeah.
of you. I imagine he would be.
Yes.
I'd love for you to finish this sentence for me.
Okay.
I am.
I am a heartfelt person who feels gratitude for the enormity of beauty in life, whether it's in pain or joy.
You are truly a blessing in this world. As I said, I've had the experience of seeing the passion you have for the work that you do, the work that you do to help people who are typically when they're coming to you in so much need, sometimes in so much pain. You are truly a blessing to this world. And there is a line on your website that I want to share, something that you say about yourself. And I think it is so true about the work that you do in the world. It says, I'm like a midwife for change, healing, and growth. Thank you, Candice.
Oh,
The world
thank you
is so
too.
much better because you are in it. And I'm so, so grateful for this time with you.
I am so grateful to you too. You're absolutely right. This was a conversation, and I really feel like you really have such an open heart and a lot of real curiosity. And it feels really like you are also a midwife for grace in the world, like bringing these things out of me in a way that I hope will be useful. So I just really appreciate you too.
They will be useful. As I said, that's the reason I knew so many of your articles, because I have devoured them. And they're so one thing that we didn't talk about is what a beautiful writer you are. Like you truly are. You have this ability. It's like, as I said, when I read the story of your first Mother's Day without your husband, I literally teared up feeling the pain of you with the chalk and, so thank you for your words too that you put out into the world. Please continue. Please continue to do what you do. I'm so
Thank
grateful
you.
for you, Candice.
Thank you. And I'm grateful for you too.